Yes, guys, hope you're all good and welcome back to the second episode of the One Coaching Educational Podcast. So today I'm joined by Harrison, and the topic for today's podcast is going to be all about volume and intensity. So we're going to be basically going through what our opinion is on where you should be on the volume thresholds, on the intensity threshold, how hard you should be training basically, and what's going to be best for your physique development and maximising muscle growth. So I think the best place to probably start is giving these things basically definitions, because there is quite a lot of different definitions with regards to what volume and intensity is. I think the best way of basically defining volume is just by doing sets per week per muscle group, pretty much. Obviously, it's going to be more, if you're going for an exact definition, it's going to be more to do with weight times sets times reps. But we'll just do sets for the ease of things. And then for intensity, we'll do proximity to failure, basically. I think that's probably the best way of doing things.
Yep.
So first thing, after that's been defined, I think we should start with what actually is effective volume and how can we get the most out of the training by using effective volume. Because often what I see is a lot of people use loads and loads of sets, but the sets that they are doing aren't very effective. In addition, they need to do loads of sets to get a lot out of the trainer. So yeah, what are your opinions on that, House?
Yeah, I think people look too much about like how much volume they're doing in terms of numbers instead of actually looking how much productive volume they're doing to start with.
Yeah.
So before I think you're looking to add sets or be like, I need more volume, I think just look at your current volume and see if it's effective or productive. I think we can kind of touch on that through having effective sets through like effective reps. Yeah, that's probably the best way to look at it.
Yeah, so by effective reps, you basically mean those reps in a close proximity to failure, which are going to be the most stimulatory for hypertrophy, basically. So yeah, we're trying to accumulate a lot of effective reps over the session to basically create the best stimulus for growth. At the end of the day, if you're training within, say, more than 4 reps away from failure, you're probably not going to be accumulating many effective reps, and therefore not really going to be getting much out of the set, because the reps that you are doing aren't really that taxing or demanding, and therefore they aren't going to give you that stimulatory response. I think also something we can look at is how you can make the quality of your volume better. So I think the main one's going to be execution. Make sure you're nailing down your execution.
100%.
If your execution's pretty poor across the board, if you're using quite a lot of momentum, not much eccentric control, that's probably going to make the quality of your volume a lot worse. Yeah. It's going to lead to you having to do more volume and potentially creating more fatigue from that as well, without getting the same amount of stimulus that you would if you were doing less volume with better execution, better accuracy, for example.
Yeah.
And therefore getting more out of your training that way as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think we should also touch on, like, when you said, like, the last 4, 5 before you fail, your effective reps. I think also looking at rep ranges and things like that. I think doing movements less than 5 reps, if you're doing the 5 reps and all the 5 reps are perfect, then yeah, they could be effective. But I feel like doing a mixture of obviously different rep ranges for different movements is the most effective way to get the most effective volume. I feel like if you're just working in one rep range, like the 6 to 8 or 8 to 10, you're not going to get as much, obviously, as again, you're going to struggle to progress that as well, because all you're doing is working in one rep range. So I think we also need to talk about your volume in terms of junk volume and progressing your volume. I feel like you have not a different stance to me on this, but I think we both agree that like there's time or place to set base volume or to start working volume up through a training block. And I think that's obviously dependent on what phase you're in. Maybe you could touch on like what you did during your contest prep in terms of volume compared to your off season.
So in my opinion, volume should always be reflective of where your recovery capacity is at a certain point of time. Yeah. So I know a lot of people like to titrate volume up during a mesocycle. In my opinion, that doesn't really make much sense, because your recovery capacity isn't actually increasing that much over like a 6-week, 7-week block. Your recovery capacity is very dependent on how lean you are, firstly, and then also how much food's coming in. But also your recovery variables such as sleep, stress management, etc. Those things are going to affect your recovery capacity as well. And that isn't going to change massively over like a 6-week block, and therefore titrating up volume, in my opinion, doesn't really make too much sense. I think the better way of doing things is just having a baseline amount of volume, which you know you get a lot out of. You know you can train hard for that, you know you can progress really well with that. And then as you go through an off-season or go through a prep or go through a diet, titrating your volume up or down depending on how you're recovering from each session, basically. So if you are going into sessions feeling like you've not recovered, say you're going into sessions with a little bit of DOMs, you're not progressing too well, the logbook isn't moving too well, then that's probably showing that you're not recovering from your sessions and probably need to titrate volume down slightly. And on the other hand, if you feel like you could be getting way more out of your sessions, you feel like you're not really training that hard, or not really feeling like you haven't done like a proper session, you don't feel like the session's being that demanding, potentially you can get away with a bit more volume. But all we're trying to do at all times is chasing the amount of volume which maximises progression, because we know that the primary driver for hypertrophy is mechanical tension and progressive overload, and therefore all we're trying to do at all times trying to maximise that.
Yeah, and I think like in terms of your contest prep, depending on what phase you've come in your contest prep from, so whether you've come straight from a push or straight from like a maintenance block, I feel like that's where you can change your volume, in the sense of you want to be able to keep the volume in that you built the muscle with to start with. You don't want to be instantly in a contest prep and instantly go, right, everything's been from 2 sets, we're going to drop it to just 1 working set. Yeah. Because these things lead to people losing muscle in preps. And I think just be reactive on where you are in that prep, whether you're like you said, if you're going into a session and you're still battered from the previous session, then maybe it's the volume you should be looking at, and not changing intensity and working RAR or things like that. And I think like
it's the same thing.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, it's the same thing for like any diet. Your changes in volume should be gradual. There's no need for that sudden change of volume. And also on the other hand, what a lot of people do is they add in volume, they add in more sets because they feel like they need to do more sets because they're not progressing anymore. And therefore to create an increase in, let's say, total volume per week in terms of weight times rep times sets, they need to add in more sets or more reps to get more volume out of it. But all you're doing by doing that is creating more of a fatigue hole and digging yourself more of a hole in terms of fatigue, and therefore you're not going to be progressing. You're probably going to be regressing quite a lot in terms of the loads that you're lifting. Yeah. Therefore you're going to be putting muscle at risk.
And like I said earlier about rep ranges, I feel like the thing that could change moving into a contest prep is not being in those like risky rep ranges. So like if people are doing sets of 4 and 5, I think that there's a time and place for that in off season. Obviously look at enjoyment or look at what you're actually trying to achieve. But I feel like moving further through your contest prep, doing things like that is something that's just going to dig you into a massive fatigue hole and just eventually end up in it's not going to be productive for retaining muscle or even growing muscle. It's more likely just going to be on the side of not being able to recover from that. And then obviously losing muscle because you're going to have to drop more volume.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So I think the main way you can look at it, and to simplify it, it's just make sure that every set that you're doing, you're getting a lot out of. It's as simple as that. If you go and do a 2-rep set, the form's rubbish, you're not going to get anything out of that set. Yeah. All you're doing is creating more fatigue, and that's not going to carry over to better performance following week. So just make sure that every single set you're doing is very effective, and if not, don't be scared to drop the volume. I think a lot of the research just says basically between 10 and 20 sets per muscle group. But I think at the end of the day, the research is not done on people who train very hard, and therefore it's not truly representative of black people in our position who are trying to absolutely maximise muscle growth. Yeah. So you really need to find what works for you. For me, I don't think I have any muscle groups over 10 sets apart from my delts. That's it. Like my delts are over 10 sets because they are such a small muscle group which don't create too much systemic fatigue. Yeah. But apart from that, everything's really low. Like even some muscle groups, like my quads are at like 4 sets per week. Yeah. And that's what I can progress from. That's what I can recover from. And that's what's led to the most growth. Yeah. Simple as that. I've had it in the past when I'm doing like 12 sets of quads a week, where I'm doing like 6 sets twice a week basically, and just not seeing anywhere near as much progression as I do now, and therefore sort of nowhere near as much growth. So we're always chasing that volume threshold to be what maximises progression basically in the gym.
Yeah, and you're also looking for that volume to be as low as possible and getting the most out of the least. You don't want to have to do 15 sets to get the most out of it. Like if you can do 5 sets a week for quads and get a lot out of it, then there's no point doing 15 and just accruing so much fatigue that it's going to eventually lead to having to drop volume and having to take deloads and things like that. I think also something that kind of people do differently, like different coaches do differently, is like timelining in deloads. Yeah. So I think like when you said earlier about when you work up volume through a mesocycle, I think there's a time and place for that. So like, say if I program a deload every 8 weeks, working volume up so you're overreaching that last week because you know you're going to take a deload. Obviously not in a contest prep, you do that in an off season. But I think things like that, if you can recover from it and keep working, and obviously you're working your food and body weight up at that time, I don't see why that's something that, obviously it's dependent for an individual, but I don't see why that's something that's going to be a harm unless it's in a contest prep.
Yeah, I think it's different ways of looking at it. I think if you can get away with it and it works for you, then that's completely fine. I would usually steer away from titrating up volume, but and I think if you do titrate up volume, it's more of an RIR approach that you're going to be training with. If you are doing that, which makes a lot more sense because obviously it's not even titrating up volume at that point, you're titrating up intensity at that point, and then when you have that weak train failure or potentially past failure, then you can overreach slightly, allow a bit more fatigue to creep in, and therefore you're basically deloading the next week to drop off that fatigue. So you're not really putting yourself in a spot where you're basically creating too much of a hole where you can't get out of, and therefore really affecting progression in future weeks.
Yeah, so I mean, I've run both approaches, and I see a time and place for both approaches. Yeah, I feel like in my off season, I obviously worked volume up and then ran it out. Like in that last week, I were doing like as much as I can. Again, still trying to get the most out of the least. But I think we spoke a lot about volume. I think touching on intensity does not mean having to like do drop sets, force reps every single session or every single movement.
Yeah.
I feel like intensity, a lot of people think is just like Ronnie Coleman style, just throwing weight, screaming, which it isn't. It's actually trying to take that target muscle to a place of failure, not just, you're not trying to technically fail. Like, you don't want your form to break down. You want to keep everything the same and that muscle fail. Because a lot of people confuse actual failure and muscular failure with technical failure, which is not. Like, obviously that's a good part to see where you're actually reaching failure yourself. If your form's starting to break down, then everything's like, obviously you're reaching failure, but that's not kind of what you want to do.
Yeah, so it's a good point, because I think people don't actually understand what true muscular failure is, because there's so many different things which affect it. For example, if you're bracing, if you're on a movement and your bracing isn't correct, you could be failing miles away from failure, and therefore that's why you have to do so many sets to get a lot out of your session. But if your bracing's really spot on, your execution's spot on, you can probably take that set a lot closer to true muscular failure, where basically your muscles are fatiguing to a point where you can't complete another rep, rather than your bracing giving way first. And therefore that's a limiting factor, not the fact that your muscles failed and the muscles are fatigued. Another one is your profile of the movement, the resistance profile of the movement. You could be failing in one end of the range, but the other end of the range is basically fresh. So for example, a hack squat, if you're basically, I know reverse banding a hack squat has a lot of negative connotations towards it, but if you're failing at the bottom of the rep, but you've still got loads to give at the top of the rep, how close is that to true muscular failure for the quads? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
definitely.
You're only really taxing the quads in that length and range, where if you just change the profile slightly, you can get a lot more out of just one set by making sure that you're failing across the full contractile range, all the way from the lengthened to the shortened. And that doesn't mean that you're getting less out of the lengthened, it just means that you're getting more out of the shortened and mid-range as well.
Yeah, I think as well, like you said on the hack squat, like you, for a long time, have ran just one set on the hack, like during prep. There has been no time in your prep where it's been, you need more than one set on your hack. Like you're approaching that one set with everything, like, and you get the most out of that one set. And like we said, in terms of volume across different movements, so like, but a volume on a hack squat or like a leg press is going to be different to the volume you can get away with on things like a hamstring curl or a leg extension. Like, I think doing 3 sets on a hack squat compared to doing 3 sets on a leg extension, obviously you're targeting, it's a different movement in general, but I feel like in terms of volume, you just need to be careful where you place it. I feel if you place it on the wrong things, that's going to drive more fatigue than the total actual sets per week you're doing.
Yeah, that's 100% right. Not all sets are equal in terms of how much fatigue they create. Don't be attached to doing 2 or 3 sets per exercise. Some exercise you might want to do 1 set, some exercise you might even go up to like 5 sets. For example, in my side delts, I'd have no problems doing like 5 sets of a cuff lateral. Yeah, definitely. Not going to dig me a fatigue hole systemically, where it's affecting other muscle groups or my training across the week, basically. But if I did 5 sets on a hack squat, I'd be ruined. Like, there would be no chance I'd be able to recover from that, and I wouldn't basically be able to progress for the rest of the week. So, making sure that you know that your volume is not all equal, and changing volume depending on how much total fatigue or systemic fatigue you're creating from each movement.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think things like, like you said with your side delts, I don't mind working up calves to 5 sets. Like,
I need to do that.
Yeah, you do need to do that. I think working like up to like 5 sets, and I think if you've got a client with an outstanding weakness, then it's gonna. Well, like you said, you don't need 5 sets. You can get away with 5 sets, and by the next week you're recovered and go for it. You're not going to do 5, like you said, you're not going to do 5 sets on a hack squat because that will take a year to recover from. You need your entire off season to recover from it. So, and then that again leads to people being confused on whether to, if you've driven fatigue up that high, like the confusion between people thinking, or sending you a message going, I need a rest day or I need a refeed, like trying to decipher which one you need. You just need to sort your volume out. You don't need either of those things. I think people are looking to just look for something else to get, like, I might need a rest day, I might need a refeed. You don't. You just need to look at your volume across the week, your intensity across the week, and change that.
Yeah, 100%. I think something we should have prefaced this whole thing with is you shouldn't be focusing on your volume if you've not even sorted out your recovery variables already. Like, those should be sorted before you even think about volume, because if you're not maximizing your recovery, you don't really truly know what your recovery capacity is. We've all got different recovery capacities depending on ourselves, but also on our lifestyles, our sleep, our stress management, etc. These things have a massive impact on how well you can recover from your training, and therefore you need to sort those out first, and then you'll know what your true recovery capacity is.
Yeah, and things like illness, high stress situations, things like that. That's where I feel like there's a time and place to auto-regulate what volume you're actually doing, because say someone falls ill, or say someone's got a full week stressful at work. I think the communication between a client and a coach as well is important in that sense. If you know that this week's going to be difficult, maybe it is right to be able to your sleep's going to be off, your recovery's going to be off, you're ill. Things like tapering back volume on those sort of weeks, I don't see there's a problem with that, as long as you're approaching the volume with the same intensity as you would, and still, like you said, main driver of hypertrophy being mechanical tension. You need to be able to get the most out of those sets.
Yeah, so I think another thing we can touch on is redundant volume. So basically, are you doing multiple exercises in a session which are doing the exact same thing, basically? Like, are you doing 2 lat focus cool downs, 2 sets on each, when they're doing the exact same thing? Like, you're better off doing just one movement, but doing more sets on that movement to reach your effective amount of volume, because as you're going through the sets on that movement, you're building up skill, and you're basically performing those sets better as you're performing them, because you're getting down that patterning, basically, of the movement patterning, and therefore nailing each set as you go along. So I see that a lot within programming, where you're doing a lot, well, not you, but people are doing a lot of redundant volume, where they're just doing multiple exercises for the exact same reason, basically. When you're better off just doing one side delta exercise, just doing more sets on that, and therefore nailing every single set even.
Yeah, I think if you look at your exercise selection across the week, if you're doing 2 push sessions, like you mentioned that you don't mind if you can still progress the same movement, and you feel comfortable doing that movement, then do it. I don't feel like taking anything away from that, unless obviously like for myself, I run 2 different laterals. Like I run 2 different laterals. I feel like doing any more than that, I just struggle to find any more that I actually like, if I'm honest.
In my opinion, it'd just be a bit pointless. Like, just pick 2 movements for each basically type of exercise, which you can split up over 2 sessions. So, for example, push A, push B. Pick 2 movements with really good profiles that you get on really well with, that you can reach muscular failure with really easily and really effectively, and then just stick to them. Simple as that. I literally only do a cuff lateral and a single arm cuff lateral. That's it. Like a crucifix lateral and a single arm cuff lateral, and each one push sessions, and that's literally it. If I need to add more volume in, I'll add a set to that. I won't add in another exercise firstly from like a time efficiency standpoint, like you don't want to be in the gym for 3 hours doing going around different machines, doing multiple exercises for each time to do. This is completely pointless.
Yeah, like we're talking about fatigue as well. I feel like we've pretty much just gone on to exercise selection, but I feel like doing more movements, especially like things like a contest prep or dieting phase, I feel like doing more movements on different things, you're going to take more time warming up. You're going to accrue more fatigue doing that. You're going to be setting up different machines. And I feel like that's actually going to take away from your session rather than add anything.
Yeah.
So I feel like adding like peak off season, sometimes I had three sets on a press. I could recover from that and I could progress all 3 sets. So things like that is fine. Instead of adding like another press or another movement onto the end of the session where you're going to have to re-warm back up, reset the machine up, and it just takes your session 10 times as long.
Yeah, I've moved to like a form of programming where I'll never really have more than one movement for a muscle group, or like for example, a push day, I wouldn't have more than one incline press. I wouldn't have more than one costal press. I wouldn't have more than one. Even right now, I'm programming like a lot of just one tricep movement per day. I wouldn't program 2 tricep movements because I don't believe that it's actually needed. I think you can get a lot more out of a session. So you're doing 5 or 6 movements per session rather than 8 or 9. Yeah. You get a lot more out of it just because you're more focused over those 5 or 6. And you can get a lot more effective volume out of those movements as well.
Yeah, I feel like you need to look at, as well as that, we've just touched on everything here. I feel like as well as like the frequency, like the organisation of your volume, where that's placed across your week, I feel like that's also quite important in the sense of how many sets you can get away with in your each session.
What are you laughing at?
Oh, you were laughing. You're about to start laughing. What's so funny about talking about frequency?
We literally just like covered everything that you could possibly cover in this video.
Yeah, it's literally the best podcast. We don't need to do anymore.
But I think something that we should finish on really is the enjoyment factor. Yeah, so I think when it comes to intensity, I think the main variable in terms of basically choosing what intensity to train at is what do you enjoy training with? Yep. Do you enjoy training to failure, or do you enjoy training to RIR, training with RIR? And that's basically going to affect how much volume you need to do to maximize your progression. If you're training with RIR, you're probably not going to get away with just doing 1 set per exercise at the end of the day. You're probably not going to get enough out of that. You're probably not going to reach your minimal effective volume thresholds to make sure you maximize your progression. But if you're training to failure, you're probably not going to be able to get away with 4 or 5 sets for every single exercise because you're going to create too much fatigue through that, and that's going to affect your recovery and therefore not going to progress in future sessions as well. So picking how you enjoy to train and then adjusting your volume thresholds depending on that. So for example, I think a loose way of just like defining things is usually for people who train to failure with pretty much every set, I'd say between 5 and 15 sets per muscle group, and then people who train with more RIR, anywhere between like 10 and 25 sets per muscle group. And then obviously just adjusting it on you as a person and what works best for you.
Yeah, and again, like we need to also make sure that these sets are being progressed week to week. And I feel like the only issue with RIR is I feel like the reason I don't use that is because each week I won't feel like I'm progressing. Only thing I think I'm doing is just like getting closer to failure. Yeah. And then each week, and then your volume's too high, and then you're just going to be battered, and then you end up doing 3 sets with 2 RIR. Now you did 3 sets to failure. And I think that's where the progression, instead of actually progressing the load or reps that you're actually doing. So I feel like volume is good as long as you look at it in the sense that it's effective volume. Like you define your volume as effective volume. You don't just define it as the amount of sets you're doing, like the amount of hard sets you're doing. I feel like that is where people struggle the most with determining how much volume to do.
Yeah, I agree. I actually do really like the RIR approach of training, but I think it's very unique that someone will actually get the most out of it just from the enjoyment perspective. I think a lot of people really enjoy going balls to the wall and then their training sessions and basically leaving everything on the table. And that's just the way they enjoy training, and therefore they're going to be excited for their sessions. Also, I think the top and back off set approach, there's nothing special about it. It's like, there's nothing special about it. The only good thing that not the only good thing, but the main reason why I think it works for so many people is because you've got 2 sets there, or 1 set, whatever, 1 to 3 sets there, and you know there's a different goal for each set where you have to progress on that rep range. It's simple as that. And it makes things a lot less monotonous you can basically enjoy your training much more with that approach.
Yeah, definitely.
And therefore you're going to get the most out of your training.
Yeah. I think that's pretty much summed everything up.
Yeah, so that is the second episode of the Educational Podcast, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you have enjoyed it, check out our other podcast episodes. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Like this video as well. And we'll catch you in a bit.